I'm Marilyn Herron, Director of the Rogers Center for Holocaust Education and Stern Chair in Holocaust Education at Chapman University. For most of last year, due to COVID restrictions, we were not on campus. Our classes were held on Zoom and our events were virtual. So tonight, while we're pleased to welcome those at a distance who are viewing by live stream, it is a special joy to greet those of you who are actually here, physically here. We are, of course, still in the new normal of masks, hand sanitizer, and vigilant care for ourselves and one another. But tonight is a crucial step in our return to being an in-person community of students, faculty, supporters, and friends. So thank you for being at the very core of that idea of community. Our lecture series this year focuses on the theme, New Perspectives on the Holocaust. I am delighted to welcome back to Chapman University, as the first speaker in our series, distinguished scholar and author, Dr. Wendy Lower. In fall 2014, Dr. Lower spoke about her award-winning book, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields. This evening, she will speak about her latest book, The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. If you've not already done so, you will have the opportunity to purchase the book after Dr. Lower's presentation, and she has graciously agreed to sign copies. And I would just like to single out for special thanks the Follett Bookstore folks who are here, staying late, coming and hauling books and doing all the things to make this possible tonight. Thank you very much. And everybody here promises to buy at least 5 books apiece. Dr. Lower is the John K. Roth Professor of History and Director of the Ravine Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. She also chairs the Academic Committee of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Dr. Lower is the author of several monographs, including Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, and many articles and book chapters. From 2016 to 2018, Dr. Lower was the acting director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. We are very glad to have her back in California. As we will learn this evening, Dr. Lower's research constitutes a masterclass in forensic investigation and archival detective work. Her book is a testimony to her commitment to restoring to the victims of the Holocaust their humanity as subjects, not objects, of history. And her book also serves as a powerful reminder that within every seemingly ordinary or every seemingly anonymous image, every photograph, there is evidence waiting to be discovered, each a unique contribution to history and memory, each Holocaust photograph a rejection of the Nazis' quest to obliterate the individuality of those they persecuted. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wendy Lower.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I have not been out in the world in so long, and to see all of you here just is really so moving, so touching. Thank you so much, and for all of you watching from home as well, or wherever you're watching from your dorms, I just want to thank you so much for coming out tonight, and for this subject too, for this very serious subject matter. And thank you, Marilyn Herron, and thank you to the Chases. We just had a really wonderful dinner with them, and I learned more about.
When they might need to put the microphone.
Oh, okay. Learned more about Chapman University and all the wonderful things that are happening here from your dean and some of the other faculty. And this is a wonderful institution, and it seems that you've all endured this hell that we've kind of gone through with this pandemic, and we're on the other side of it, I hope, and back to learning and back in the classroom. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'm inspired by all of you being here. Okay, so today I want to talk to you about this photograph. And want to walk through with you the kind of the book and why this photograph and what was the discovery process. And Dr. Herron already mentioned a couple of the highlights of it, of some of the arguments underlying it. I was inspired to write this book for a couple of reasons. First of all, we live in a visual age. And there's no denying that. I had worked at the Holocaust Museum for many years, and if you've been to the exhibits there, you'll see that there are a lot of blown photographs, and that photography is absolutely part of how we tell stories. It's part of the evidence of the Holocaust. It's how we learn. And yet, visual literacy is, I found as a teacher and as a professor, there are kind of limitations as far as how we are displaying images, how we're interrogating them, how we are putting stories together based on these images. And I just felt strongly that this was an area where we could do more work. And we've all seen how one photograph of suffering or violence can move audiences and propel humanitarian action and social justice. Iconic images of atrocities, think about the naked girl fleeing from a napalm attack in Vietnam, little Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi's corpse, little boy in the red t-shirt who washed up on that Turkish beach, Honduran girl crying while her mother was searched at the US-Mexican border, and Jewish Holocaust victim kneeling over a pit in 1941 with a gun to his head, and even images like those, the iconic images from the Holocaust, like the gates, the railway leading into the gates of Birkenau. These all become part of our kind of general knowledge, our recall of the past, or recall often of very traumatic events, and part of our collective memory of particular historical disasters. Yet they are widely circulated and displayed with little information about the circumstances or persons pictured in them, and usually even less about the photographer. So I was concerned about images that become kind of standard illustrations, but are not studied as historical documents. I knew that the most graphic images were the subject of scholarly debates, but what should or should not be displayed? What were the rules on how they should be studied and taught and researched, and the ethics and methods of inquiry? I just want to warn you tonight that this is a lecture about atrocity photography in the Holocaust, so we're going to be looking at some pretty disturbing images, and that's the history, that's what we're studying. And we're going to make every effort to talk about them and look at them a little bit more closely, and one image in particular, which is the focus of my book. Now, up on the screen, you're seeing the entryway to Birkenau, the railway lines. Below that is this image I just referred to, which is, if you actually had the photograph in your hand and you flipped it over, on the back it said in German, "The Last Jew in Vinica," written in German, no date. But it's often displayed at Holocaust museums around the world. It's also been brought into kind of commercial use. It's been put on mugs. It's been put on T-shirts by anti-Semitic organizations. The middle image is the little boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, also very famous image from April 1943, which was originally in a Nazi perpetrator's photo album that he presented to the Reichswehr SS, kind of showing that he had completed his work in liquidating the ghetto. Below is the image from Buchenwald that shows Elie Wiesel on the bunk, lying down actually in the back, and Frank on the top. The image below that is also another image of the Holocaust, of a killing of a family in southern Ukraine. It's actually been cropped. A lot of these images we don't see in full form, and that's another question about how we display them and what we're seeing. That is a German special killing unit, the man with the rifle, and he's gunning down that woman holding that child, and the family is kind of running in front of her. They're in a field in southern Ukraine. And then, of course, the images of corpses, of bones, after the liberation of the camps. Those are from Bergen-Belsen. So these are the things that are kind of part of our world, our visual recall, our visual memory. And when I talk to students at the beginning of the semester, when I teach my course on the Holocaust, most of the time they kind of refer to these images. And then if I push them and I say, well, what's going on there? And can you give me some information about them? And the room, everybody kind of falls silent. So here's the focus of my talk tonight. An image from 1941. Was taken October 13th, 1941, in a town in Ukraine called Miropol, and I'll show you where that is on a map in a moment. But right now I just want to focus on this image and encourage you actually to look at it closely. And when we get to the Q&A, I welcome your questions as well, as far as what you're seeing or what you think you're seeing. Now, when I saw it in 2009, it was August 2009, I was actually at the museum in the archives, back in the day when you could actually go sit in the archives and gather around different people and do that kind of research. And I was actually there working on something else, so it really was serendipity as part of the story as well. And two journalists had arrived in the museum from Prague, and they had this image, and it was part of a series of 6 other images from this massacre. And they had found it in the Prague archive. It had been locked up in that archive since the 50s. Okay, so we have this obviously very incriminating image that has not seen the light of day. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, they found it because they could get into the archives. And they came to the museum to find out more about it and the history. And my colleague came up to me and said, Wendy, you work on Ukraine. This was taken in a region where you've done some research. What do you think of this? Tell us more. Can you tell us more? And so as I started to look at it, I started to pick it apart in my mind. I was drawn to certain elements of the image. I found it very intriguing that there were these shoes, empty shoes in the kind of foreground with maybe papers or something, maybe cloth, some material there. And over time, I would look more closely at that, and actually, with the advent of technology, digital technology, we'll zoom in and zoom out. This is also part of the story of research, like what are the tools that we have available to us to discover more. And as you zoom into this image, you start to see bullet casings on the ground, kind of litter of mass murder that's there. So that's a clue that the guns had been firing before this picture was actually taken. There were more victims. But of course, the shoes, having worked at the museum in DC and being up on the 5th floor, just below me was the display of the shoes from Birkenau behind the glass window there. Just gave me pause and reflecting and memorializing the loss of life and the absence of life, or the presence of absence or the absence of presence, that someone had already been killed and this was what was left, and possibly going to be recycled for the local community, because all of the victims' material possessions were either confiscated during the murder or at the murder site were then given to the local population as a kind of payment for participating in the killing action. And what about the fact that it's broad daylight? And this is happening, this killing action, this massacre of this family is happening in this open setting, unlike the history that we know well, what people mostly recall, the image of the railway lines leading to Birkenau, of a Nazi killing, a Nazi genocide that was a modern industrialized killing. And now what we're learning about more and more, which is the Holocaust by bullets that my friend Father Patrick DeBron has pointed out. And what about the other victims of the Holocaust who died outside the gassing facilities? 1 out of 4 victims of the Holocaust resided in what is the territory of Ukraine today. Most people don't think about Ukraine as an epicenter, a place, a terrain of mass murder. And most of those victims, estimates go 1.5 million that we've been able to kind of tabulate based on some records of family records and birth records and population records and all of that. So the number, when I started working on this in 1992 in this field and went to Ukraine for the first time, the estimate was 900,000 Jews died in Ukraine during the Holocaust, and now it's up to 1.5. So we are discovering more victims by doing this kind of research. And they were killed in the open-air mass shootings. They weren't registered, they weren't tattooed, so it's very difficult to identify them. They are, in many ways, missing from our memory, missing from our textbooks, and this is what of course, the genociders that was their goal, that complete erasure. So a lot of this is trying to recover that history with whatever fragments we can find, whatever traces we can find. A lot of this work as well in this book has been informed by the fact that genocide studies in more contemporary cases that we have has benefited from all this technology, from ground penetrating radar, from aerial photography, from forensic work, from DNA work, right? So these modern cases of investigation are helping us go back to the Holocaust and think about new ways of interrogating sources and looking for evidence. Even though it's, the witnesses are mostly gone and the survivors are fading from the scene, there's that potential for discovery because we know how people are operating in these other cases today and can apply that. So the landscape is really important. And environmental history is another field that is kind of on the rise and is teaching us about how we read the environment and how we think about nature as a source of agency, how the Nazis put nature to work outside the killing, well, even in the camp system, but certainly in these mass shootings in places like this ravine, or the ravine in Babi Yar, which we're commemorating in about a week, that they, didn't need to dig a pit. They used that nature, they dynamited the walls, and that the soil actually suffocated the victims, and the victims died, in the pits because of the Germans were, in a sense, putting nature to work. And if, in fact, this is happening in the environment in this way, aren't there different remains, different ways to identify that as far as the decomposition of the victims in those sites? What happens to the flora, the vegetation in those areas? And can that provide more clues as far as the locations of these murders, the number of victims, whether those graves have been disturbed already after the war? There was quite a lot of vandalism in these sites, so-called black diggers going in trying to get valuables and pull things out of those graves or around the perimeter. When Jews were going to those sites, they were often throwing the most valuable things out. They didn't want the local communities to go in and dig these things up and take them. They were throwing them around the edge, so the entire area is often disrupted, the landscape, the digging that goes on. And that means something else as far as not just this forensic kind of technical scientific work, but what about Jewish religious burial customs and laws? And the reality is that this is yet another assault on those victims who are buried with their clothing on, and then their souls are once again disturbed by the diggers, by these vandals who go in, which is also a continuing problem in Eastern Europe. The killers in this image. We have something rather startling here. Certainly it was in 2009 that the conversation about collaboration was just kind of taking off. The book Neighbors had come out about Poland. And this conversation continues today, although it's turned into the direction of kind of whitewashing collaboration and suppressing collaboration. But here we have collaboration in its extreme form, collaborating in the act of killing. Germans with their caps on, I can see their visors, I can see their Nazi insignia, I can see the cap, you can see it's actually an eagle there on the cap. And then these men standing next to them, they're actually wearing Red Army repurposed coats. They're standing shoulder to shoulder. They don't speak the same language, and yet they somehow can together carry out this terrible act of murder against this Jewish family. We see the smoke billowing up. It's an action shot in the worst sense. Also something rather rare, most of the photographs of the Holocaust, you can find them on the internet, say at the museum. Hundreds of thousands of them have been digitized. There are hundreds of albums at Yad Vashem, for instance. So that entire archive of imagery pertaining to the Holocaust. I mean, the Second World War was not only the most global, most, as far as deaths to civilians, the greatest calamity we have on record, but it was also the most photographed. The pocket camera had come into use. The Leica had been patented. The Zeiss icon had been patented in the 1930s. This was something that soldiers brought with them. They had this camera in their knapsack. The Germans were saying, "You're fighting this war. This is our great triumph, and we're going to document it for posterity." But there were limits to what they should document, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. But there were very few photos in this large archive of imagery. Very few photos that actually show the act of killing, the atrocity as it's happening. And the smoke here is yet another clue. And I showed this to some ballistics experts actually, who explained to me, I wanted to know why is the smoke there's this like a halo effect. There's a space in there near the woman's head, and as it was told to me, this is part of the muzzle blast and the heat. There had been firing before this, and it's execution style, it's simultaneous firing, and that is the blast kind of actually penetrating through the smoke as it's billowing up, and that creates a kind of halo effect over her head. And the family in the center, the little boy, barefooted boy, holding on to the hand of the woman. She's wearing those Mary Jane shoes. She's got that polka dotted dress on, and they're clustered together. She's trying to shield them in some way. Eventually, with again the use of the technology and zooming in and out and looking at this from all different angles, and then actually going to Prague and looking at the original print, I believe what I could discern was on her lap here, it looks to me like there's another child, and who's kind of kneeling down. But of course, the composition of this image, and I'll talk about the photographer in a second, because it was deliberate the way he cropped this, placing the family at the center, also raised questions in my mind about the importance of the family. The importance of the family in history, and especially in the history of genocide, and specifically the history of the Holocaust. So much work had been done in the Lemkin vein, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide. What do we mean by group selective killing? What are we talking about when we're talking about those who are targeted? Are we talking about race? Are we talking about political group? Are we talking about class? Are we talking about religious affiliation? And how different groups identify themselves and then become, in the minds of the perpetrators, the enemy. But what about the family and the idea of root and branch genocide, which is to go after genealogically in the ways that the Nazis were so obsessed with genealogy. If you join the SS and we're asked you to show your family tree going back to the 18th century to make sure you were purely Aryan and your blood was free of Jewish blood. So for a genealogically kind of racial state, the family destruction of the Jewish family was an absolute necessity in Hitler's thinking. In the summer of 1941, when the mass shootings began, when the Holocaust by bullets began with the invasion of the Soviet Union, a few months after this photo was taken, in July 41, Hitler was meeting with his Croatian ally, and he said, not one Jewish family is to survive on the continent of Europe. It was very specific about the family. He said that over the years, he was his own historian, over the years, the Jews, they had been expelled from Spain, they had been pushed out because of the pogroms in the 19th century, but they always come back, and the children will avenge the parents. A family member will bring them back. And so this was part of that extreme thinking, eliminationist thinking on the part of the Nazis. And the family also is an important theme when you think about this, the experience of genocide, whether you're witnessing it. So these collaborators, these Ukrainian collaborators, they had family. That's also part of the story. They went home to family. So did these Nazi killers. And the Jews, of course, made so many decisions, life and death decisions, if they could, if there was time, if it was possible. And it revolved around the family. Who was going to emigrate? Who would go first? Who would be saved? Who was most vulnerable? And those were, who should know what? Should the children be told? And, it was important for the Jewish experience of experiencing the most horrific thing you can imagine, being murdered with your family members. It was just an added level of cruelty on the part of the genocidaires. But how that was, when you talk about Jewish resistance, you can't factor out the family, right? So I put that at the center of my book in many ways, and the photographer, the composition of photos kind of like helped me go to that place. This was one of the things the photographer brought, this team of journalists in August 2009. So we've got this photograph, October 13th, 1941. You've got a date, you've got a location, and we've got the name of the photographer. And here is his interrogation. This is in Slovakian. It's from 1958. So now we know a little bit more about the photography. It even says, if you can read this Slovakian, I had to bring a lot of colleagues in, including Holocaust survivors when I was at the museum, were helping me translate these documents. This is European history, and it requires all these different languages. So what we learned from this interrogation is actually tells us the make and model of his camera, and that's going to be very important. I'll tell you in a moment. But he describes that day, and his name was Lubomir Skrovina, and he was from Banska Bystrica. This interrogation from 58 is the now Soviet authorities, the KGB-like authority in post-war Soviet Czechoslovakia, and they're bringing him in and saying, you've got these incriminating photos. These photos were really important for the wheels of justice. Decades later, until this day, these photographs can start cases. They can actually lead to convictions. And so he's questioned about these photographs, and he says, well, I was at my barracks that morning, and we heard a lot of commotion, and the gunfire and the screaming, and my commander said, go check it out. He was the company scribe, and so he was an avid photographer. So it was not only his role to kind of document and keep the history of his unit, but he also had that pocket camera, so he brought it with him. And so he went there with his comrade, and the Nazis, for those of you who might not know this, especially the younger folks in the crowd, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, and this was their big battle, and this is, as I mentioned, when the actual killing phase of the Holocaust started, it was an Axis campaign. The Hungarians, the Romanians, the Slovakians, the Croatians, they were all in it together because they were all trying to defeat the communist enemy, the Bolshevik enemy. They also called it, they conflated the Jews with the Bolsheviks. They called them the Judeo-Bolshevik enemy. So this is why we have this Slovakian, right? So you've got Ukrainian collaborator killers, Germans leading the organizing this and mandating it, and a Slovakian in uniform taking pictures, right? I thought the photographer was a collaborator. This is not a picture. Doesn't look like a picture that someone took clandestinely. We have some atrocity photos that clearly show that someone's kind of taking it, through a buttonhole, and it's a little bit off kilter, it's blurry, but this is such a stable and composed image, and it's close up. He tells us what camera he had. He didn't have a zoom lens, there was no zoom lens. So he's right at the center of the action. And he does tell us in his interrogation that he was free to circulate and take images at the scene. And so he took more than one. He actually took at least 6. Here's another one. And you can see it is the same almost the same combination there. You have those Ukrainians with their armbands holding the rifles. You can still see the shoes there. And then the Germans, there's one more German, and we also have a better view of that German from the front. And you can see his markings on his uniform more clearly. And they're killing this Jewish woman, and she's by herself. Now, when I published the book earlier this year, interesting, I saw on her left elbow, it looked to me like an armband with a marking on it, potentially either a star or a circle, because either one was used when they were marking the Jews. But I don't know, someone wrote to me and said that they thought that was possibly another victim in her arms, maybe an infant. So I don't know. Sidebar, since the book has come out, because it's about research and discovery, and I walk people through it, I get an email like almost every week, which is, I think I see this, I think I see that. It's almost like I'm crowdsourcing, what's happening there, but it's been incredibly helpful because people around the world have different expertise, and they've been applying it and volunteering it to me in an incredibly generous way. So in that regard, there's like a community of people working on this, and you have no idea until you put something out there just how many people are trying to solve these. It's not even a mystery, but to actually find out more. So here is our photographer who took this series, and there is his camera, which I eventually was able to find with the help of my colleagues at the Holocaust Museum in Bratislava. And that camera, as it turns out, the film, when I was able to actually examine it and research it, on that day he had a strip film that could only take 8 pictures. Right? So this is important for the material culture part of this story, again, which I'm interested in, having worked in a museum, that it's not just the photographs, it's the photographs in conjunction with the documentation, in conjunction with the objects, and how you can corroborate or how they can provide different pieces that can be brought together to build a story. And here's Lubomir Skrovina in September 1941, so about a month before he took this photo, and this was taken in Mariupol. In the town where he was stationed, where the massacre occurred. And he's in the center there with the glasses, and he's taking it in a photo studio in Mariupol. And interestingly enough, photography was a very important occupation within the Jewish community in Eastern Europe. And even someone like Marc Chagall was actually originally a photographer, and a lot of the artists and a lot of the cultural innovations in photography actually came from Eastern Europe in this time with the advent of the photo studio and all these different techniques. The Nazi campaign, as I mentioned, really promoted or really pushed the use of photography among ordinary soldiers who, here's an advertisement from military journals telling you, that you should have this brand of a camera. It's called the Optical Panzer, so it's strong enough to withstand, any kind of shrapnel or warfare. And so the Germans were very, the sense of triumphalism and triumph over the enemy was also part of that, was this use of photography. But they couldn't control the distribution of the images once the apparatus were out there, the cameras themselves were out there. And multiple times, as soon as the killing operation started, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS in charge of these actions, immediately issued orders to not take pictures of these actual massacres because they were going to fall into enemy hands and they were going to foment resistance. And he was right. One of the only cases of an SS officer who was brought to trial during the war, during the Holocaust, a man named Max Teugner, was because, and he was punished because he took pictures of that were kind of barbaric in the sense that they were atrocity images that were pornographic, and he was a primary killer in the Holocaust. So he was convicted not for killing Jews and murdering Jews. The judge said, it's okay, that's according to state policy. What's not okay is that you're taking these photos, and that's against the orders that were issued against photography, photographing these atrocities. So these photos, atrocity images, absolutely disturbing to look at and study and analyze and research. But this also raises the question of resistance. And that when these images are created that are so incriminating, and think about some of the worst incriminating images that you know of, whether it's images of lynchings in the South or other atrocities in our own history, the power of those images, once you start to study them and realize that they are documenting that crime, they're so incriminating, right? But often they surprise you because they're taken not as a triumphant, racist kind of affirmation, but as I learned in this book, they also are, because of the power and agency, they are in a sense a resistance. There's like inherently there's the potential for resistance in those photographs. So by that I also mean that an image like the one that we're looking at today, and some like that, did make it into the Polish underground and were reprinted and reproduced. And instead of writing, a resistance fighter kind of writing an article in a newspaper or going and spray painting or crossing out the swastikas and different acts of resistance that were possible. Like what's possible when you're trying to resist what survivor from Auschwitz said? It was like throwing sand into a machine. Like just when it seems like it's futile, what do you have within your means? And with this advent of photography and the incontrovertible evidence of the picture of 1,000 words and the fact that it's documenting crime, they were really important during the war and the way that they circulated in informing the Jewish community what was happening and also organizing and bringing other people, in this case the Polish underground, into this cause. And to this day, those images are part of what survivors also think of as a kind of exhortation or a sense of kind of resistance. Part of my research took place over at the USC collection, the Show Foundation collection, and I decided to go through systematically and look at the video testimony and see like what photographs do survivors put up, because there are some scholars who are saying, we shouldn't look at these images. We shouldn't put them up. We shouldn't study them. It's denigrating to the victims. And that is denigrating to the victims, what I showed you. That woman and that woman, and I don't know what the children, if they comprehended it. That is not how they wanted to be at their last moments, to be photographed in that way. But on the other hand, what about when survivors take photographs and they put them right in front of the camera and they say, this is what happened to us. Don't forget. This is the truth. This is the fact, and this is what happened. So that's something that I grappled with in my work, but I think it's also important to think about how these images can be utilized in that way, as, of course, respecting the dignity of the victims, but also fighting against, resisting this history, resisting what the genociders sought to achieve, which is total erasure, suppression, and distortion of what they did. So Mirapol, this town, this shtetl, is actually, this is an earlier map, a 17th century map, and these are Jewish communities in Ukraine, and some of these kind of don't exist anymore. I mean, these are really small, like little villages. If you compare this with a map of Ukraine today, you just wouldn't find them. So Mirapol's kind of in the center, one of the larger locations here on these Jewish settlements from the 17th century, just to highlight the fact that this was a very deep, rich history. In fact, the Dybbuk, which is a Yiddish play that is often staged kind of traditionally, and a very famous ethnographer named Otsky actually went into these villages before they vanished, before mass immigration, and then the Russian Revolution basically wiped out these communities. Mirapol is the location for this actual play. And so that was obviously part of the local community's sense of pride and history, which did not survive. When I went back to Mirapol, this is the center of the town, and first time in 2014, this is what was left of the marketplace, which was a Jewish kind of center. And you see those holes, those gaps there in the structures, which was originally completely a complete square, a very vibrant community, and the bazaar happening every Saturday or on the weekend, and Planet Peasants would come in, and just it's an incredible past that is just not there anymore. And when I stood there and looking at this monument to the Second World War, that's what this is here, and that champagne bottle kind of down on the bottom. And then behind that is what was the Jewish school, and now it's an ATM dispenser. And understanding when genocide happens, what that loss is. What is loss of a people mean as far as loss of a civilization, of a local economy, of a way of life? Not being overly romanticizing or nostalgic or pretending that it was entirely peaceful, but these kind of vacancies here, I think, are speak to that. Not to mention the fact that this was a century of Sovietization and then hyperinflation when the Soviet Union collapsed, and Ukraine is still at war right now with Russia. The Jews who were killed in the photograph were forced to gather here in the marketplace, and then where that man is coming up on his bicycle, they were actually walking down in that direction that morning on October 13th, 1941. The number who were killed that day, the community itself was about 980 Jews, and that was kind of the last of the community, the remnant of about 280. A few so-called specialist craftsmen, the dentists, were selected out, and about 90 survived that massacre in October, and then they were killed in January 1942. Before they were brought to the massacre site, they were detained, some of them in this police station along the way, and there you can see down below in the basement the bars on the windows, and there is testimony from the Germans, actually. So the photograph is sitting in the archive. The Germans go back to West Germany. The Ukrainian killers, the policemen, they stay in the Soviet Union and go into hiding. One of them is arrested, but after 15 years and goes into Russia, comes back. So in the 80s, those Ukrainian killers in the photo were still around. And the Germans in the 1960s were also questioned. So the justice story on each of the people and the killers is kind of different for each country. You can see how that transpired within those kind of national frames. And the Germans, it turns out, when I studied those uniforms, I thought they were like Himmler's SS, Gestapo, or maybe border police. And in that testimony that Lubomir gave, he said literally, the German killers were finance guards. And I just hung on to that because it was an important detail. Why would he know that? Why, often the non-Germans would just say, oh, they were Gestapo or they were Army. They couldn't distinguish the units, so they said finance guards. And then as I started to study their uniforms, I realized that they weren't at all the insignia of the SS, and that the buttons are different and the cuffs are different on the border police uniforms, and they don't have the emblem isn't as large on the cap. And indeed, they were customs guards. They were supposed to be at the railway station checking packages, and at the post office checking mail. And on the Sunday, the night before the killing action, as I learned from the testimony of the West Germans, because they were ultimately questioned, the men in this photograph in 1969. But the West Germans did not have this photograph. They're just questioning them. So it was really interesting to have the photograph and then read the German testimony, because the Germans were just lying, saying they weren't there, they didn't do the shooting, the Ukrainians did all the shooting. But the SS had come into town. The town was so small they didn't actually have a headquarters there or a station. And they walked into the local canteen. And they said to those customs guards who were hanging around, they were playing Scott, which is a German card game, and they said, why are there Jews in this town? They shouldn't be here anymore, and so you better take care of this immediately. And who wants to volunteer? And these customs guards, these two guys, or three guys, two of them stood up and said, "Jawohl, I will. I'm there. I'll see. I'm going to participate in this." So justice was not achieved in the case of the German killers. The victims were brought along a path here. This is a drawing from the 1980s, because the Ukrainian killers were actually found and they were brought to trial. And so the Soviets did a very thorough investigation, and they made the Ukrainians reenact what happened and walk the path from the town down here into the park, which is where the photograph was taken down here. You can see a little legend, little pictures of trees and everything, and this is the actual murder site that's in the photograph. And the Ukrainians were found in '85 by a very determined prosecutor in Teugner, who wanted to do the 40th anniversary, wanted to pursue just one more chance, one more way. There's no statute of limitations in Ukraine. They had reinstituted the death penalty in Soviet Ukraine, and in fact, he tracked these killers down, and they stood trial in 1986. There were 3 Ukrainians, collaborators, local militia. One of them was only 17 years old when he was shooting. So he was a minor during the event and was given 15 years sentence in the Soviet prison system in 1986. The other 2 were adults and were executed by firing squad shortly after the trial. But when I went to Ukraine the first time in 1992, it's just amazing if you think he was incarcerated, convicted in '86. Close to the Soviet Union, Ukraine gets its independence in August '91. He could still be around. But I did not find him when I went back and inquired. The local mayor didn't know if he had ever come back. What about the family? How do you find, for me, this was the greatest challenge, and also even kind of ethically what I really wanted to achieve as far as that horrible photograph, not how they wanted to end their lives, not in that way, not on film. And where do you start? What do you do? Well, these are lists of names. When the Soviets came back in 1944, they had their own investigations, extraordinary commission. They started to collect names. And again, I noticed that these names here that are handwritten, they're in family clusters. There are dates there. There's the surname of the family, and then the wife and the children, and then their birth dates. So I started to go through these lists. I only had about 400 names, and I only had half of the victims' names. But I kept going because that's all I had, and I just wanted to keep digging. So I realized, too, in the photo that it's difficult to date the age of the mother, right? You can't see, and of course, in those days, it's even harder to tell, to date the age of a woman, whether she's 30 or 60 in this angle and so forth. So, but that boy, right, looks like he walked up. She held his hand. He was a toddler. So, 4, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like how old is that boy? It was possible then to actually go back to these lists and look for family clusters and look for a little boy who was born, about that time. And so I went through at Yad Vashem, went through these these listed names, and in their pages of testimony, this is the way that you did research there, that survivors had come and filled out forms testifying to the loss of loved ones or distant relatives. and state where they were killed. And here's one from Mirapol, describing the murder of an individual in Mirapol. And going A through Z, trying to just find any clue that might relate to the photograph and the dating of that child's birth, and maybe that constellation of that other child on the lap, maybe another older child on the lap. And when I came to this page, I was so immediately just taken by, gripped by this image. And so few of the pages of testimony in Nova Shem actually have photographs attached to them. The archivist said that less than 1%. And a wartime photograph. This was taken, this is what's left of a Jewish family in Mirapol. This is late summer 1941. Their husbands had been killed already, or they left with the army or fled. It's just this kind of remnant of women and children. And this little boy here, to me, just with that sailor suit, just so reminded me of the boy in the photograph. And then that other child, kind of frail, maybe the other child on her lap, maybe the woman on the right is actually the woman at the center of the photograph. Went back to Mirapol with this photograph. You can see Ukrainian witnesses looking at the photograph who, I recognize some of the women in the photograph, recognize them from the marketplace because the family ran the soda fountain or owned a shop, and she remembered that as a child. Or here we have a Ukrainian witness. This is when I went with Yohanan Gunam and his team, the Father Devois team. This young boy during the war, he was elderly now, he was working in the fields near the massacre site, and went and looked to see. He was curious. He was a child. He was curious. And he's pointing out exactly, there he's identifying the killers that he saw. And he was very upset, actually, because his mother had told him as a child, never go into the woods. Never, ever go into the woods. It's dangerous in the woods. And he didn't tell her because he didn't want to get beaten. He didn't want to be scolded for going into the woods. So I think it was an interesting moment when he was able to finally tell everything that he had seen, that story, that what he had witnessed was carrying around. And again, another witness, Ukrainian woman now, as a child, was in the marketplace peering out the window watching whilst the Jews were gathered the night before. And we went to the site. We had that drawing from the Soviet record. We could follow that path to the site, and went with some researchers and videographers to try to see what was there, and found that the landscape was really visibly distorted, disrupted. That we went from being a kind of level area to a lot of different mounds, and the vegetation was completely skewed, and it just was a place that we realized had not there was no sense there that there was drainage or anything there that was naturally happening in terms of erosion. It was just a kind of a crazy landscape. And we actually started to just walk around and move the soil around a little bit, and we actually found bones of the victims. This was in 2016. And so the reason why these were so close to the surface, and I have a chapter in the book about, again, the environmental history and kind of the importance of the landscape here and the mass graves, what happens with mass graves in the landscape. During that Soviet investigation in the 80s, they needed victims' remains as part of the trial, as part of the case. And so they went into the massacre site, and they did some pretty aggressive exhumations with tractors and bulldozers, and they did find the remains, and they buried some of them in town and erected a small memorial with the help of the Jewish community. But in the process, they disinterred all those victims and just left in the forest there those bones. I just just want to read a little bit from the end of the book. This going back to the issue of the shoes and the search for the missing, and the missing as I call them, because the family that's at the center of the photograph, I could never positively, definitively identify them. And the reality is that there are many victims of the Holocaust, many victims of genocide that no one is left to come forward to testify that they're missing. That entire families are gone. And what is that reality when we just don't even know the existence of a community because no one's left to actually claim them as missing. The empty shoes and the crumpled coat exist there as questions, as gaps in knowledge. They remind us of the victims whom we cannot see, the many who were murdered and remained missing. Prior to and during the Holocaust, empty shoes figured in abstract art, literature, and photography as symbols of humanity. And the use of shoes to depict loss is not only a post-war curatorial technique of Holocaust museums. Historical sources of material culture, these shoes have come to aestheticize absence and mourning on a large scale. Stanzas from the Yiddish poet Abraham Sitzkaver, his poem, A Load of Shoes, were written upon the discovery of his deported mother's shoes in the Vilna Ghetto in Lithuania. And now I'm going to read a little bit from his poem. This is from January 1943, written by Abraham Sitzkaver upon the discovery of his deported mother's shoes. The feet from these boots with buttons outside, or these with no body, or these with no bride? Where is the child who fit in these? Is the maiden barefoot who bought these? Slippers and pumps. Look, there are my mother's. Her Sabbath pair, in with the others. In Sitzkaver's poem, empty boots, slippers, and pumps exist somewhere between the living and the dead, among the children, maidens, and brides at a wedding or observing Sabbath. His shoes dance in pattern. They stimulate our ability to imagine the past and provide poetic testimony to the lives of the wearers. Unlike those haunting but inert objects we see today, enshrined behind glass in Birkenau or bronze as a memorial alongside the Danube River in Budapest. One photograph, too, can pass across time and space from its creator to family members, prosecutors, curators, historians, and the viewing public. It can put things in motion and elicit from those who study the image or are questioned about it an avalanche of information and emotion. It tugs at our ethical sensibilities. At first sight, it shocks, repels, seems impossible. But the afterlife of the photograph can become an ongoing story with twists and turns. Like testimony given in words, it can be subject to manipulation, such as cropping and airbrushing. And like flawed testimonies and memories, photographs can mislead because they can never completely capture the reality of the event pictured for those involved. The Jewish man who was murdered, perhaps with his family, is not there, although his empty shoes and crumpled coat remain. We cannot see beyond the frame of the image. We cannot turn 360 degrees to take in the entire setting of victims waiting to be killed, other possible onlookers, including our Slovakian photographer and his comrades, and more German officers. The paper strewn amid the bullet casings at the edge of the mass grave could be German lists or Jewish identity documents. Atrocity images, especially the rare ones that attest to acts of genocide, the crime of all crimes, offend and shame us. When we turn away from them, we promote ignorance. When we display them in museums without captions and download them from the internet with no historical context, we denigrate the victims. And when we stop researching them, we cease to care about historical justice, the threat of genocide, and the murder of missing. Thank you.
So, we have time for a few questions. I know we want to turn to the book signing without too much delay, but with safety in mind, we're going to ask if you have a question that you raise your hand from where you're seated. And when you're called on, please ask your question as succinctly as possible for one of our staff with the microphone to repeat for our speaker and those who are listening and watching from at home. So if we have Question? Go ahead. Again, please, as succinctly as possible.
I want to know what it was that made you do this as your life's work.
I'm just going to repeat the question here so it can be picked up. What was it that made you decide to do this as your life's work?
That's a big question. Well, I always knew I wanted to be an historian, and I made that decision. And I was a Europeanist, I studied German history and German language, and as I discovered this history, I realized that this was very serious, that it was something I needed to work on. So it was a decision as far as how I wanted to, what I wanted to teach and what I wanted to learn and what I wanted to try to prevent. So it's a combination. I don't have a personal connection to the history, and so I feel really privileged to be able to research this history and kind of have that distance. Doesn't mean I'm not sensitive to it and it doesn't move me and give me nightmares and all of that. But I do have that kind of advantage in a way that, and also in talking to participants and witnesses too, there's a little bit of distance, and I think they feel a little bit more comfortable too, to be honest. So that's been helpful. And it was what was so formative when I was growing up. Because so much of what we do is because we're in a moment in our lives. So we could never imagine. I mean, so many students say they want to major in this, they want to become